The temperature outside Severin Holmgren's earthen dome had dropped to 32 degrees below zero, yet inside, without stoking the fire for 6 hours, the air remained a comfortable 54 degrees. Across the frozen Dakota prairie, his neighbors huddled around dying fires in their timber cabins, burning through the last of their precious wood, while wondering how the Swedish immigrant they had mocked for 8 months was surviving the blizzard of 1869 with barely any fuel at all. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight. Wind screamed across the Dakota Territory prairie with nothing to slow it down, driving snow horizontally across the barren landscape. Visibility beyond 10 feet disappeared entirely. The cold was the kind that killed livestock in their pens and turned exposed skin black with frostbite in minutes. February 1869 was proving to be one of the harshest winters anyone could remember, and the homesteaders scattered across the grasslands were learning brutal lessons about survival on the treeless plains. Inside his dome-shaped earthen structure, Severin Holmgren sat at his small wooden table, writing in his journal by candlelight. His brother Dag slept peacefully on the raised sleeping platform across the room. The interior of the dwelling was quiet except for the muffled howl of wind outside and the occasional soft crack from the stone hearth where a modest fire burned down to coals. Severin wore a single wool shirt. His hands were steady as he wrote, not trembling with cold. He noted the time, 9 o'clock in the evening, and the interior temperature, based on the mercury thermometer he had mounted on the wall, 54 degrees. He had last added wood to the fire at 3 o'clock that afternoon, 6 hours earlier. The few sticks of precious cottonwood he had burned were hardly enough to heat a standard cabin for an hour, yet his structure maintained warmth that would be comfortable even without the fire. The walls themselves radiated heat inward, absorbed during the previous day and released slowly through the night. Severin had predicted this would happen. He had built the structure specifically for this purpose. But experiencing the reality of his calculations still filled him with quiet satisfaction. Outside, less than half a mile away, his neighbors were suffering. Severin knew this because 2 days earlier, before the blizzard intensified to impassable conditions, he had walked to the nearest homesteads to check on people. What he found had disturbed him. Thaddeus Hargrove, the English settler who had mocked Severin's construction methods most loudly throughout the previous summer, was burning furniture to stay warm. His supply of hauled cottonwood from the distant river breaks had run out a week earlier. His family huddled in a single room, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, feeding chair legs and table planks into a desperate fire. Hiram Lockwood, the American homesteader whose cabin had burned down in December from an overheated stove, was sharing cramped space with another family. Their combined body heat and a dangerously hot fire kept the temperature barely above freezing. They were surviving, but only through constant vigilance and fuel consumption that could not be sustained much longer. Bernt Rolfsson, the Norwegian neighbor who had been cautiously friendly to Severin despite the community's general ridicule, was rationing his wood supply so carefully that his family slept in shifts, keeping one person awake to tend the fire and prevent it from dying completely. Severin closed his journal and banked his coals for the night. The interior would stay warm until morning. The story of how Severin Holmgren became the warmest man on the Dakota prairie began 16 months earlier, in the spring of 1868. He arrived in the territory with his younger brother Dag, 2 wagons of supplies, and a land claim certificate for 160 acres of grassland near what would eventually become the town of Vermillion. The brothers were Swedish immigrants who had spent 3 years working in lumber camps in Minnesota, saving money for their own homestead. They were competent, hard-working, and cautiously optimistic about their prospects. The land they claimed was typical of the region, flat, treeless, covered in prairie grass that stretched to the horizon in every direction. A small creek ran through the eastern portion of their property, providing water but no timber. The nearest cottonwood groves were 5 miles away along the larger river breaks. This scarcity of wood was immediately obvious to anyone who looked at the landscape, but most settlers accepted it as a manageable inconvenience rather than a fundamental problem. Severin saw it differently. During their first week on the claim, he and Dag visited the neighboring homesteads to introduce themselves and understand how people were managing. What they found was a community united by a single overwhelming challenge: fuel. Every homesteader they met talked about wood. Where to find it, how to haul it, how to stretch limited supplies through the winter. Men spent days at a time traveling to distant timber areas, cutting cottonwood and hauling it back in wagons. The work was exhausting, and the supply was never adequate. Thaddeus Hargrove, whose claim was closest to the Holmgren brothers, explained the situation with the confidence of someone who had survived one winter already. He had a small sod house, common in the region, built partially underground with thick earthen walls. It kept out wind, but required constant fire to stay warm during winter. Thaddeus estimated he had burned through 6 cords of wood the previous winter and expected to need 8 cords for the coming year as his family expanded. When Severin asked about alternatives to wood, Thaddeus laughed. There were no alternatives. Some people burned dried buffalo dung when they were desperate, he said, but it was a last resort for those too lazy or unlucky to secure proper fuel. The dung burned quickly, smelled terrible, and was considered beneath the dignity of serious homesteaders. Civilized people burned wood. That was simply how things were done. Severin listened carefully, but said nothing about the idea already forming in his mind. That evening, back at their camp, he told Dag about a conversation he remembered from childhood. Their grandmother in Sweden had spoken about old ways of building, methods used before modern materials became common. She had mentioned structures built with earth and organic materials that stayed warm through Scandinavian winters without constant fires. Severin had been young when he heard these stories, but the principles had stayed with him. Now, facing a landscape without trees, those half-remembered lessons seemed suddenly relevant. The first month on their claim taught the Holmgren brothers exactly how severe the timber shortage was. They needed to build some kind of shelter before winter, and every option required wood they did not have. A traditional cabin demanded hundreds of logs. Even a modest sod house needed timber for roof beams, door frames, and window supports. The nearest cottonwood grove was a full day's journey with an empty wagon, longer when loaded with cut wood. Severin spent a week traveling to the river breaks with other homesteaders, observing how they worked. The cottonwood trees that grew along the waterways were twisted, irregular, and difficult to work with. They were not the straight pines of Minnesota forests. Men cut what they could find, loaded wagons until the axles groaned, and made the slow journey back to their claims. A week of hard labor might yield enough wood to frame a single room or provide fuel for a few winter weeks. The economics were impossible to ignore. Time spent hauling wood was time not spent improving land, planting crops, or building infrastructure. The entire community was trapped in a cycle of fuel acquisition that consumed resources without creating lasting value. Severin watched Hiram Lockwood return from a timber expedition exhausted, with barely enough wood to finish his cabin roof. The man had spent 11 days on a task that should have taken 2 if timber had been locally available. Back on their own claim, Severin walked the property with Dag, examining what resources they actually had. Grass covered everything, thick prairie sod with root systems that went down 3 feet or more. The creek provided water and clay from its banks. Scattered across the grassland were dried buffalo droppings, left behind by the massive herds that had grazed here before settlement pushed them west. These dung deposits were everywhere, free for the taking, dismissed as worthless by everyone except desperate people with no other options. Severin picked up a dried buffalo chip and examined it closely. The material was light, fibrous, completely desiccated by sun and wind. It would burn, certainly, but Thaddeus was right that it burned quickly and provided less heat than wood. Using it as fuel seemed inefficient. But what if it was not fuel? What if it was something else? His grandmother's stories had mentioned mixing organic materials with earth to create walls that held heat. He could not remember the exact details, but the principle made sense. Organic fibers reinforced clay, creating insulation. Dense earth absorbed and stored warmth. If those two properties could be combined in the right proportions, the result might be walls that did more than simply block wind. That night, Severin proposed his idea to Dag. They would not build a wooden cabin or a standard sod house. They would build something different, a dome-shaped structure with walls made from earth, clay, and buffalo dung. The foundation would be packed with the densest mixture, creating thermal mass that could absorb heat during the day and release it at night. Severin's grandmother had been a repository of old knowledge, the kind of practical wisdom that was disappearing as Sweden modernized. She had grown up in a rural village where people still remembered pre-industrial building methods, techniques developed over centuries of harsh Scandinavian winters. Severin had spent childhood summers at her cottage, listening to stories that seemed irrelevant at the time but had lodged in his memory with unexpected persistence. She had told him about ancient pit houses, structures built partially underground, with earthen walls and roofs. These dwellings stayed remarkably warm in winter because the earth itself provided insulation and thermal mass. The ground below the frost line maintained a relatively constant temperature year-round. By building into that stable environment and using thick earthen walls above ground, people created shelters that required minimal heating fuel. The key, his grandmother had explained, was understanding how heat moved through materials. Wood blocked heat transfer but did not store heat. A wooden cabin could be made warm, but the moment the fire died, warmth escaped through the walls and roof. Earth was different. Dense earth absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. A thick, earthen wall warmed by fire during the day would radiate that heat inward through the night, long after the fire went out. She had also mentioned the importance of organic fibers mixed into earthen building materials. Straw, animal hair, and even manure could be combined with clay to create a composite material stronger than clay alone. The fibers prevented cracking as the material dried. They created tiny air pockets that improved insulation. They bound the mixture together, giving it structural integrity that pure earth lacked. Severin had been perhaps 10 years old when he heard these explanations. He had not understood the physics or appreciated the practical applications. But his grandmother had been insistent that he pay attention, telling him that old knowledge was valuable even in a modern world. Methods that worked for 1,000 years worked because they solved real problems. Forgetting them was foolish. Now, sitting on treeless prairie with winter approaching and no timber available, those childhood lessons returned with sudden clarity. His grandmother had given him a framework for understanding thermodynamics in building design. She had explained principles that most homesteaders never considered, viewing shelter as simply keeping out wind and rain rather than as a system for managing heat. Severin spent several evenings sketching ideas in his journal, trying to reconstruct what he remembered and apply it to prairie conditions. He drew cross-sections of walls, calculating thickness and composition. He sketched dome shapes, remembering something about curved structures distributing weight and reducing surface area. He made notes about material ratios, guessing at mixtures that might work. Dag watched these preparations with growing concern, asking reasonable questions about whether they should not just build a normal sod house like everyone else and avoid potential failure. Severin's decision to build with buffalo dung created an immediate problem. He needed vast quantities of the material, far more than was casually scattered across his own claim. The collection process began in late May 1868 and would consume most of the summer. What started as a practical task quickly became a source of community-wide mockery that would define Severin's social standing for months to come. The brothers loaded their wagon each morning and drove across the prairie, systematically gathering dried buffalo chips. The work was tedious and unglamorous. Severin had calculated that he would need approximately 4 tons of dried dung for his foundation and walls. At an average weight of 2 pounds per dried chip, that meant collecting roughly 4,000 individual pieces. Even working efficiently, they could gather only 300 to 400 chips per day, filling the wagon bed and returning to their claim to unload before repeating the process. The dung had to be properly dried to be useful. Fresh droppings contained too much moisture and would rot if incorporated into earthen walls. Severin wanted material that had weathered on the prairie for at least one full season, ideally longer. He developed an eye for identifying the best specimens, rejecting pieces that showed signs of moisture retention or degradation. Dag followed his brother's instructions, but questioned the sanity of being selective about manure quality. Word of the Holmgren brothers' activities spread quickly through the scattered homesteading community. Thaddeus Hargrove encountered them during one collection trip and asked what possible use they could have for wagon loads of dried dung. When Severin explained that he intended to build his house with it, Thaddeus stared in disbelief before bursting into laughter. He rode directly to the nearest neighbors to share the absurd news that the Swedish immigrants were planning to live in a structure made of buffalo shit. The story circulated with embellishments. Some claimed Severin was too poor to afford proper building materials. Others suggested he was mentally unsound, driven mad by the isolation of prairie life. A few speculated that this was some bizarre Swedish custom that civilized Americans could not be expected to understand. The general consensus was that the Holmgren brothers were wasting their time on a project that would inevitably fail, leaving them without proper shelter when winter arrived. Severin heard the gossip during his infrequent trips to the small trading posts that served the area. Men made jokes within his hearing, expecting reactions. He offered none, simply purchasing his supplies and leaving without engaging. Dag was less patient, growing angry at the disrespect and suggesting they should defend themselves or explain the engineering principles behind their plan. Severin discouraged confrontation. Talk was meaningless, he said. Results would speak clearly enough when winter came. By late July, they had accumulated enough dried dung to begin construction. The material was stacked in organized piles near their building site, sorted by size and quality. Neighbors who passed by shook their heads at the sight, certain they were witnessing the prelude to failure. Construction began in early August with the foundation, and Severin approached this phase with the same obsessive precision that characterized all his work. Most sod houses had no formal foundation at all, simply thick earthen walls built directly on cleared ground. Severin understood that his structure required something more substantial. The thermal mass system he envisioned depended on a stable base that would not settle or shift as the heavy earthen walls were built upward. He selected a building site on a slight rise, elevated enough to ensure drainage during heavy rains. The location provided good sight lines in all directions and positioned the structure to take advantage of southern exposure for passive solar warming. Severin marked out a circle 20 feet in diameter, larger than most homestead cabins but necessary for the dome design he had planned. The circular shape would provide maximum interior space while minimizing exterior surface area, reducing heat loss. The foundation trench was dug 18 inches deep around the entire perimeter. Severin insisted on precise depth and width, measuring constantly and rejecting Dag's suggestions that approximate dimensions would suffice. The trench needed to extend below the frost line to prevent heaving during winter freeze-thaw cycles. He had seen buildings damaged by frost heave in Minnesota and would not risk similar problems here. Gathering foundation stones consumed 2 weeks. The prairie offered scattered limestone and granite deposited by ancient glaciers, but finding pieces of appropriate size and shape required extensive searching. Severin wanted flat stones that could be fitted together tightly, creating a solid base with minimal gaps. He rejected rounded river stones as unsuitable, insisting on angular pieces that would lock together under weight. The stones were laid dry, without mortar, in overlapping courses that distributed weight evenly. Severin tested each placement, ensuring stability before adding the next stone. The work progressed slowly, sometimes only a few feet of foundation completed in a full day's labor. Dag grew frustrated with the pace, arguing that they were wasting valuable construction time on unnecessary perfection. Thaddeus Hargrove visited during the second week of foundation work, ostensibly to borrow tools but clearly curious about the progress. He examined the circular stone base and asked pointed questions about the design. When Severin explained that the foundation would support a dome-shaped structure with walls 2 feet thick at the base, Thaddeus laughed openly. He predicted the walls would collapse under their own weight or crack apart during the first hard freeze. He offered to wager $10 that the structure would not survive its first winter intact. Severin declined the bet, but did not argue the point. He simply continued placing stones, fitting each piece carefully into the growing foundation. By late August, the stone perimeter was complete, rising 8 inches above ground level and providing a level, stable platform for the walls that would rise above it. The foundation represented 3 weeks of labor that most homesteaders would have considered wasted effort. But Severin knew that everything built above this base depended on its stability and precision. The dome framework required engineering calculations that Severin worked out through trial and error sketches. He had no formal training in architecture or structural design, only practical carpentry experience from lumber camps and an intuitive understanding of how curved structures distributed weight. The principle was simple enough in concept but challenging in execution. A dome transferred loads downward and outward along curved paths rather than straight vertical compression. Done correctly, the shape was remarkably strong for its weight. Severin designed a framework using flexible green willow branches gathered from the creek bottom. Willow could be bent without breaking when freshly cut, and it would hold its curved shape as it dried. He cut poles 12 feet long, stripped the bark, and sharpened one end of each pole to drive into the ground inside the stone foundation perimeter. The poles would form ribs running from ground level to the apex of the dome, creating a skeletal structure that would support the earthen walls. The geometry required precision. Severin marked positions around the interior of the foundation circle, spacing the pole locations to create even distribution. He calculated that 18 vertical ribs would provide adequate support without excessive weight. Each rib needed to curve inward at the same rate to meet at a central point 14 feet above ground level. Getting this curvature consistent across all 18 poles demanded careful measurement and adjustment. Dag helped drive the sharpened pole ends into the earth inside the foundation, then pull them inward and lash them together at the top. The framework began to take shape as a skeletal dome, fragile-looking but surprisingly rigid once the ribs were properly secured. Horizontal willow branches were woven between the vertical ribs at intervals, creating a lattice that would support the earthen plaster. The weaving process took days, threading branches through the framework and lashing each intersection with cordage made from twisted prairie grass. The completed framework looked like an oversized basket turned upside down. Neighbors who saw it expressed confusion about how this flimsy structure could possibly support the weight Severin claimed he would pile onto it. The willow framework weighed perhaps 200 pounds. The earthen walls would weigh several tons when completed. The mathematics seemed impossible to anyone without understanding of how dome geometry distributed loads. Severin tested the framework by hanging weights from various points and observing how the structure flexed and recovered. He reinforced areas that showed excessive movement and adjusted the lashing at critical junctions. By mid-September, he declared the framework ready for the plastering phase. Dag remained skeptical, questioning whether his brother truly understood the forces involved or was simply proceeding on faith and guesswork. The truth lay somewhere between confidence and uncertainty. Severin believed his calculations were sound, but he had never built anything like this before. The only way to know if the design would work was to complete it and observe the results. Failure would mean wasted months and facing winter without adequate shelter. Success would prove that old knowledge, combined with careful adaptation, could solve new problems in unexpected ways. The earthen plaster that would form the walls required precise ratios of clay, soil, and dried buffalo dung. Severin had no formula to follow, only principles remembered from childhood and experiments conducted through late summer. He set up a mixing area near the creek where clay could be dug and water was readily available. The process of developing the right mixture would consume 3 weeks of testing before actual wall construction could begin. Clay from the creek bank formed the base of the mixture. Severin dug down 2 feet to reach clay deposits with the proper consistency, rejecting surface material contaminated with organic matter or sand. Good clay held together when squeezed but remained workable when moistened. He needed clay that would bind the mixture together and provide waterproofing once dried, but not clay so pure that it would crack as moisture evaporated. The dried buffalo dung required preparation before mixing. Severin and Dag spent days breaking the dried chips into smaller pieces, then grinding them against rocks to create fibrous material of varying coarseness. The dung separated into long plant fibers that had passed through the buffalo's digestive system and finer, powdered material. Both components proved useful. The long fibers would reinforce the clay like straw in adobe. The powder would add bulk and create tiny air pockets for insulation. The soil component came from excavating areas around the building site. Severin wanted sandy loam that would prevent the mixture from becoming too dense and heavy. Pure clay would create walls with excellent thermal mass, but would crack badly during drying. Soil lightened the mixture and improved workability. Finding the correct ratio required making test batches with varying proportions and observing how they dried. Severin created sample bricks using different mixture formulas. He labeled each batch carefully in his journal, noting the ratio of clay to soil to dung. Some mixtures cracked as they dried. Others remained too soft, lacking structural integrity. A few showed promise, drying hard, without significant cracking, and exhibiting the fibrous reinforcement he wanted. He tested these promising samples by soaking them in water to check waterproofing, then breaking them to examine internal structure. The formula he eventually settled on used 3 parts clay to 2 parts sandy soil to 1 part processed dung by volume. This ratio produced a mixture that was workable when wet, dried without excessive cracking, and showed good cohesion from the fiber reinforcement. The dung content seemed low to Dag, who questioned whether such small amounts would provide the insulation Severin claimed. But higher dung ratios produced mixtures that dried too light and crumbly, lacking the density needed for thermal mass. Water content proved equally critical. Too much water made the mixture soupy and impossible to apply to vertical surfaces. Too little created a stiff paste that would not adhere properly or fill gaps in the willow framework. Severin developed a feel for the correct consistency through repeated mixing, learning to judge by texture and behavior when worked with his hands. By late September, he had refined the mixing process and accumulated enough prepared dung for the foundation layer. The actual wall construction could begin, starting with the densest, most dung-rich mixture at the base where thermal mass mattered most. The wall application began with the foundation layer, the most critical section of the entire structure. Severin had calculated that the bottom 3 feet of wall should contain the highest concentration of dung and clay to maximize thermal mass. This layer would absorb heat from the interior fire and radiate it back during cold nights. He prepared a special mixture for this section using 4 parts clay to 2 parts soil to 2 parts dung, creating a denser composition than the formula planned for upper walls. The application process was physically demanding and maddeningly slow. Severin worked from inside the willow framework, pressing handfuls of wet mixture against the lattice and pushing it through gaps until it bonded with material applied from the outside where Dag worked simultaneously. The mixture had to be packed tightly, eliminating air pockets and ensuring solid contact with the framework. Each section needed to be built up gradually in layers, allowing partial drying between applications to prevent sagging under its own weight. The smell during this phase was overwhelming. Wet buffalo dung released odors that carried across the prairie, announcing the Holmgren brothers' activities to anyone downwind. Neighbors complained that the stench made the area unpleasant for half a mile in any direction. Thaddeus Hargrove rode over specifically to express his disgust, suggesting that living inside walls made of manure would be unbearable and that Severin was creating a health hazard that endangered the entire community. Severin ignored the complaints and continued working. The smell would dissipate as the walls dried, he explained to Dag, who was growing sensitive to the social isolation their project had created. The wet dung odor was temporary. The warmth the walls would provide was permanent. That trade-off seemed obvious to Severin, even if others could not see past immediate discomfort to future benefit. The foundation layer took 4 weeks to complete. Severin built it up slowly, allowing each 6-inch section to partially dry before adding the next layer. The wall grew thicker at the base, reaching 24 inches at ground level and tapering to 18 inches at the 3-foot height where he planned to transition to the lighter mixture for upper sections. This taper was intentional, distributing weight and creating a stable profile that would support the dome above. Once the foundation layer had dried sufficiently, Severin switched to his standard mixture for the upper walls. This section rose more quickly because the thinner mixture and reduced wall thickness allowed faster application. The dome shape became increasingly apparent as the walls curved inward, following the willow framework toward the apex. Dag's initial skepticism about the framework's strength proved unfounded. The structure supported the growing weight without excessive deflection. By late October, the walls had reached the top of the framework. The final section around the smoke hole at the apex required careful shaping to create proper draft for the interior hearth. Severin left an opening 18 inches in diameter, larger than necessary for smoke exit, but sized to accommodate a chimney extension he would add later. The last handfuls of plaster were smoothed into place as the first serious cold weather arrived. The exterior surface required finishing work to create a smooth, weatherproof shell. Severin prepared a final coating using pure clay, mixed with just enough dung fiber to prevent cracking. This layer was applied thin, perhaps half an inch thick, and worked smooth with wooden tools shaped from scrap willow. The smoothing process took days, working methodically around the entire dome surface to eliminate rough spots where water could collect and cause erosion. The doorway presented unique challenges. Severin had left a gap in the wall during plastering, creating an arched opening 4 feet high and 2.5 feet wide. The arch was deliberate, distributing weight around the opening better than a rectangular doorframe would. But creating a door sturdy enough to seal this opening required carpentry skills and materials the brothers had carefully conserved from their Minnesota lumber supply. Severin built the door from thick planks sawn from a single cottonwood log he had hauled specifically for this purpose. The planks were fitted edge to edge and reinforced on the interior face with diagonal cross-bracing. He carved simple wooden hinges from hardwood, knowing metal hinges were beyond his budget. The hinges were mortised into both the door and the earthen door frame, then pinned in place with wooden pegs. The result was crude by furniture standards, but functional and reasonably weathertight. A wooden bar mounted on the interior provided the locking mechanism. The bar dropped into brackets carved into the earthen wall on either side of the doorway. When engaged, the bar connected the door to the structure, making forced entry difficult. Severin added a secondary feature, a wooden peg system that allowed the bar to be lifted from outside using a specific sequence known only to him and Dag. To others, the door would appear to have no exterior lock. The smoke hole required a chimney extension to create proper draft and prevent downdrafts during high winds. Severin built this from stones stacked in a circular pattern, rising 18 inches above the dome's apex. The narrow chimney diameter prevented rain from entering in significant amounts while allowing smoke to exit efficiently. He topped it with a flat stone that could be adjusted to partially close the opening during extreme weather. Interior finishing was minimal but purposeful. Severin built a raised sleeping platform along one curved wall, elevating the sleeping surface 2 feet above the earthen floor. Storage space beneath the platform held supplies and equipment. A small wooden table and 2 simple stools provided furniture. Shelves mounted high on the walls kept food stores away from moisture and rodents. The hearth was built from flat stones set into the earthen floor near the center of the structure, directly below the smoke hole. The hearth stones were carefully selected for their ability to withstand repeated heating without cracking. Severin arranged them in a shallow depression, creating a fire area that would radiate heat outward while capturing ash for easy removal. By early November, the structure was complete. 3 months of labor had produced a dwelling unlike anything else on the Dakota prairie. It looked strange, almost primitive compared to the rectangular sod houses and few timber cabins scattered across the landscape. But Severin was not building for aesthetics. He was building for survival. Severin lit the first fire on November 8, 1868, choosing a cold morning when frost covered the prairie grass. He wanted to test the structure's heating performance under realistic conditions before the truly severe cold arrived. The fire was small, just a handful of cottonwood sticks arranged carefully on the stone hearth. He lit the kindling and watched smoke rise through the chimney opening, checking for proper draft. The smoke drew upward smoothly, pulled by the chimney's height and the temperature differential between interior and exterior air. No smoke leaked into the living space. The narrow chimney opening created enough velocity to carry combustion gases up and out without allowing downdrafts to push smoke back inside. This initial test confirmed that the basic ventilation design functioned as intended. Severin monitored the interior temperature throughout the day, checking his thermometer every 2 hours and recording observations in his journal. The fire burned steadily but modestly, consuming perhaps 5 pounds of wood over 6 hours. This was dramatically less fuel than a conventional cabin would require to maintain comfortable warmth. The question was whether the earthen walls would absorb heat as he predicted and release it overnight when the fire died. The wall surface near the hearth grew warm to the touch within the first hour. By midday, warmth had spread across the entire interior wall surface, though the areas farthest from the fire remained cooler than those nearby. Severin placed his hand flat against the wall at various points, feeling the heat radiating from the clay and dung mixture. The thermal mass was working exactly as he had hoped, storing energy from the fire rather than simply blocking cold air. As afternoon progressed into evening, Severin allowed the fire to burn down to coals. He did not add fresh wood, wanting to observe how long the structure would maintain warmth without active heating. The exterior temperature dropped as the sun set, falling to 20 degrees by 8 o'clock. Inside, the thermometer read 58 degrees. The walls were releasing stored heat, compensating for the dying fire. Dag sat at the table, comfortable in a single shirt, marveling at the warmth surrounding them. He had doubted his brother's calculations and questioned the months of effort invested in this strange structure. But experiencing the reality of what Severin had built changed his perspective entirely. The dense earthen walls were performing exactly as predicted, functioning as a thermal battery that required minimal fuel input to maintain comfortable conditions. Severin let the fire go out completely around 9 o'clock. He banked the coals and sealed the hearth with a flat stone to prevent any residual heat from escaping up the chimney. The interior temperature at that moment was 56 degrees. He set his journal aside and prepared for sleep, telling Dag they would check the temperature first thing in the morning to see how much heat the walls had retained overnight. The brothers slept without additional covering beyond their normal bedding. The air remained still and comfortable throughout the night. When Severin woke at dawn and checked the thermometer, it read 51 degrees. The interior had lost only 5 degrees over 9 hours with no fire at all. December brought the first serious cold to the Dakota prairie, and with it came the reality that would separate successful homesteaders from those who would abandon their claims. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. Wind swept across the grassland with nothing to slow it, driving wind chill to levels that made outdoor work dangerous and brief. The scattered settlers hunkered down in their various shelters and learned which construction methods would sustain them through a prairie winter. Thaddeus Hargrove's sod house, built the previous year using conventional methods, required constant attention to stay marginally warm. His walls were thick earth, adequate for blocking wind, but they provided no thermal mass benefit because they were built directly against a wooden frame that created an insulating gap. Heat from his fire warmed the interior air but did not penetrate the walls. The moment his fire diminished, interior temperature dropped rapidly toward exterior conditions. Thaddeus found himself feeding wood into his fireplace every 2 to 3 hours day and night. He and his wife took shifts through the dark hours, one person sleeping while the other maintained the fire. The work was exhausting and the fuel consumption was staggering. He had stockpiled what he thought was adequate wood for winter, but by mid-December he realized his supply would not last until spring. He began rationing fuel, allowing interior temperature to drop into the 40s at night and burning furniture when necessary. Hiram Lockwood faced worse circumstances. His cabin had burned in early December when an overloaded fireplace created a chimney fire that spread to the wooden roof structure. He had escaped with his family but lost the cabin and most of their possessions. Another homesteader had taken them in, but the combined families strained resources and created tension. Two families in a space designed for one meant inadequate sleeping arrangements, depleted food stores, and dangerous overcrowding around a fireplace pushed to maximum output. Other settlers experienced variations of the same struggle. Wood supplies dwindled faster than anticipated. Structures built quickly without attention to thermal efficiency proved inadequate. People burned corn cobs, twisted hay, and dried buffalo dung when wood ran out, learning that alternative fuels provided some heat but nothing approaching the sustained warmth of proper timber. The community that had mocked Severin's construction methods was discovering that conventional approaches barely met minimum survival standards. Severin and Dag, meanwhile, lived in remarkable comfort. Their daily routine involved lighting a modest fire in the morning, maintaining it at low intensity through the afternoon, and allowing it to die in the evening. The earthen walls absorbed heat throughout the day and radiated it back through the night. Interior temperature ranged from the mid-50s to low 60s, regardless of exterior conditions. They slept soundly without fire tending, woke to a structure that remained warm, and used perhaps 1/5 the fuel their neighbors consumed. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Settlers passing near the Holmgren dome noticed minimal smoke from the chimney even during the coldest days. Those who visited out of curiosity found the interior surprisingly warm, and the brothers relaxed rather than exhausted from constant fire maintenance. January 1869 brought temperatures that old-timers would reference for decades afterward. A high-pressure system settled over the northern plains, and temperatures plummeted to levels rarely experienced even in that harsh climate. The thermometer at the small trading post recorded -18 degrees on January 12th, -23 on the 13th, and -28 on the 14th. These were daytime highs. Overnight lows dropped below -40. The cold was dangerous in ways that transcended discomfort. Exposed skin froze in minutes, breathing the air hurt. Livestock died in their pens despite shelter. Water froze solid in containers kept inside heated structures. The challenge was not merely staying warm but preventing deadly heat loss that could kill while people slept. Maintaining adequate fire became a life-or-death necessity that consumed every waking moment for those in poorly insulated shelters. Severin's structure faced its most severe test during this cold snap. He monitored interior temperature obsessively, recording measurements every few hours and adjusting his fire management accordingly. What he discovered validated his design in ways even he had not fully anticipated. The massive earthen walls, once thoroughly warmed, released heat so slowly that interior temperature remained stable even as exterior conditions reached lethal extremes. On January 13th, with exterior temperature at -23 degrees, Severin maintained a small fire from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. He burned perhaps 12 pounds of cottonwood, less than most homesteaders would consume in 2 hours. At 4 o'clock he allowed the fire to die completely, sealing the hearth and recording an interior temperature of 61 degrees. Through the night, as exterior temperature dropped to -42 degrees, the dome's interior cooled gradually. Severin woke every 2 hours to check the thermometer, documenting the temperature drop. By dawn, after 14 hours with no fire, the interior had fallen to 53 degrees. The walls had released stored heat throughout the night, maintaining livable conditions despite a temperature differential of 95 degrees between inside and outside. Dag sat wrapped in a blanket at the table, watching his brother record these measurements with scientific precision. The implications were staggering. They were comfortable, genuinely comfortable, during weather that was killing livestock and pushing their neighbors to desperation. The structure that community members had mocked as a manure hut was outperforming every conventional building on the prairie by such a wide margin that comparison seemed almost unfair. Severin rebuilt the fire at dawn, a small blaze that would bring interior temperature back above 60 degrees within 2 hours. He calculated fuel consumption for the coldest night of winter and compared it mentally to what he knew neighbors were burning. His structure was using roughly 1/6 the fuel to maintain superior warmth. The economic and labor savings over a full winter were substantial. The survival advantage during extreme cold was potentially life-saving. Word of the Holmgren brothers' comfort during the cold snap spread through the scattered community despite limited travel and dangerous conditions. Those who ventured out on necessary errands reported seeing minimal smoke from Severin's chimney even on the coldest days. The blizzard arrived on February 3rd and lasted 5 days. Snow driven by 40-mile-per-hour winds created whiteout conditions that made travel impossible and turned the landscape into a featureless white void. The storm was not merely a visual obstacle. It was a sustained assault that tested every structure's ability to provide shelter and every family's fuel reserves. This was the crisis that would separate adequate preparation from failure. Thaddeus Hargrove's wood supply had been depleted by weeks of heavy consumption during the January cold. When the blizzard hit, he had perhaps 4 days of fuel remaining if he rationed carefully. But careful rationing meant allowing interior temperature to drop dangerously low at night, risking frostbite for his sleeping children. He chose to maintain warmth and accept that his wood would run out before the storm ended. By the 3rd day of the blizzard, Thaddeus was burning furniture. Chairs went into the fireplace first, then a small cabinet, then the wooden frame from a broken bed. His wife watched their possessions disappear into flames while their children huddled near the fire, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The interior temperature barely reached 50 degrees, even with constant burning. The sod walls, lacking thermal mass properties, did nothing to retain heat. On the 4th day, with no fuel remaining and the storm showing no signs of breaking, Thaddeus made a desperate decision. He would attempt to reach the Holmgren Dome, less than half a mile away, and ask for shelter. The journey in blizzard conditions was dangerous, but staying in a freezing cabin was more dangerous. He wrapped himself in layers of clothing, tied a rope around his waist in case he became disoriented, and set out into the storm. The half-mile took him nearly 2 hours. He lost direction repeatedly, circling back on his own tracks and struggling to maintain bearing in the whiteout. When he finally stumbled against the curved wall of Severin's structure, he was exhausted and beginning to show signs of hypothermia. He found the door and pounded on it with numb hands. Severin opened the door to find Thaddeus barely able to stand, covered in snow, shaking uncontrollably. He pulled the man inside and closed the door against the wind. The interior warmth hit Thaddeus like a physical force. Dag helped him to a seat near the hearth where a modest fire burned. Severin brought blankets and hot water, treating the early stages of frostbite on Thaddeus's hands and face. As Thaddeus warmed and regained his senses, he looked around the interior with new understanding. The space was genuinely warm, warmer than his own cabin had been even with furniture burning. The fire in the hearth was small, barely more than coals. Yet the air temperature was comfortable enough that Severin and Dag wore single shirts and moved about casually. The walls radiated heat inward, creating an envelope of warmth that required minimal fuel input to maintain. Thaddeus stayed through the remainder of the storm, sleeping on the floor near the hearth and watching Severin manage the fire with minimal wood consumption. The experience broke through mockery and prejudice, forcing him to acknowledge that everything he had believed about proper construction was wrong. The blizzard ended on February 7th, revealing a landscape transformed by snowdrifts that buried some structures to their roof lines. As settlers dug out and assessed damage, stories circulated about who had survived comfortably and who had barely made it through. Thaddeus Hargrove's account of his experience in the Holmgren Dome spread quickly, and the community's attitude toward Severin shifted dramatically within days. Bernd Rolfsson was the first to visit with serious questions about construction techniques. He arrived on horseback 2 days after the storm, bringing a notebook and pencil. He wanted to understand how the structure worked, what materials Severin had used, and whether the methods could be replicated by someone with basic carpentry skills. Severin welcomed him inside and spent 3 hours explaining principles of thermal mass, the importance of wall thickness and composition, and the specific ratios he had developed for the clay-dung soil mixture. Bernd took careful notes, asking technical questions about curing time, structural stability, and material quantities. He examined the walls closely, feeling their thickness and density. He studied the dome geometry and the chimney design. He asked about cost, labor time, and whether timber could be eliminated entirely from the construction process. Severin answered everything honestly, including acknowledging aspects he had learned through trial and error rather than prior knowledge. Over the following weeks, more settlers visited. Some came out of curiosity, others with genuine interest in adopting the building method. Severin repeated his explanations, eventually developing a standard presentation that covered key principles and practical steps. He sketched diagrams showing wall cross-sections, mixing ratios, and framework construction. He emphasized that the technique required more time than conventional building, but used materials that were free and abundant on the prairie. Hiram Lockwood, who had lost his cabin to fire and spent the winter in cramped quarters with another family, asked whether Severin would help him build a similar structure come spring. He had access to his own claim, now that winter was ending and needed shelter before the next cold season. Severin agreed, seeing an opportunity to refine his methods and document the process more carefully for others who might follow. The questions extended beyond construction details to deeper principles. Why did the dome shape matter? How thick did walls need to be for adequate thermal mass? Could the technique work with cow dung instead of buffalo chips? What about ventilation and moisture control? Severin did his best to answer based on his understanding, but he acknowledged the limits of his knowledge. He had built one structure, tested it through one winter. There was much he still did not know about long-term durability or variations in design. What had changed was the community's willingness to listen. The mockery that had characterized responses to his project 8 months earlier was gone, replaced by respect and genuine interest. Severin had proven through survival and comfort that his approach worked. That practical demonstration carried more weight than any theoretical argument could have achieved. Spring 1869 arrived with the usual prairie transformation. Snow melted rapidly once temperatures rose, turning the landscape muddy before grass began greening in late March. For homesteaders who had survived the brutal winter, the warming weather brought relief and opportunity to rebuild, improve, and prepare for the next cold season. Severin found himself in unexpected demand, as settlers who had mocked his methods now sought his guidance. Hiram Lockwood's structure became the first replication of Severin's design. Construction began in mid-April, with Severin providing direct supervision and Hiram supplying the labor. The process followed the same sequence Severin had developed the previous year, but with refinements based on lessons learned. The foundation went faster because Severin now understood precisely what stone sizes worked best and how to lay them efficiently. The willow framework was improved with better spacing and reinforcement at critical junctions. The dung collection phase proceeded without the social stigma that had plagued Severin's project. Word had spread about the thermal performance of dung-packed walls, and what had seemed disgusting now seemed practical. Hiram gathered material methodically, understanding that quality and proper drying were essential. Other settlers stopped to watch the work with interest rather than contempt, asking questions about technique and timeline. Severin refined his mixing ratios based on winter observations. He had noticed minor cracking in some wall sections during freeze-thaw cycles and adjusted the formula to include slightly more fiber content for flexibility. He also developed a technique for applying the mixture in thinner layers that dried more uniformly, reducing crack formation. These improvements were incorporated into Hiram's structure, creating what Severin considered a second-generation design superior to his original. The plastering phase attracted visitors who came to observe and learn. Severin explained his methods to anyone who asked, demonstrating proper application technique and discussing the importance of wall thickness at different heights. Several settlers took notes, clearly planning their own projects. Bernd Rolfsson sketched detailed diagrams of the construction process, creating documentation that could be shared with others across the territory. By early June, Hiram's dome was complete and drying in the summer sun. The structure looked nearly identical to Severin's, though slightly smaller in diameter to accommodate Hiram's single-person household. Severin advised letting the walls cure for at least 4 weeks before moving in, allowing moisture to escape and the clay to fully harden. Hiram used the waiting period to build simple furniture and gather supplies for the coming year. The success of Hiram's project encouraged others. Bernd Rolfsson announced plans to build a similar structure on his claim before winter. 2 other families expressed interest in the technique for spring 1870 construction. What had been a singular experiment was becoming a recognized building method with growing acceptance across the scattered homesteading community. Severin found satisfaction in seeing his innovation adopted by others, but he took no credit beyond sharing information freely. He had not invented thermal mass construction or dome architecture. He had simply adapted old principles to new circumstances using materials others had dismissed as worthless. The technique worked because it solved real problems with abundant resources. That practical effectiveness was driving adoption more powerfully than any promotion could have achieved. Gregor McPherson was a Scottish trader who traveled a circuit through the Dakota Territory settlements, bringing goods from distant suppliers and carrying news between isolated communities. He arrived at the small trading post near the Holmgren claim in late June 1869 and heard multiple homesteaders discussing the strange dome structures that somehow stayed warm through winter with minimal fuel. His curiosity was professional as well as personal. Innovations that helped settlers survive were good for business because surviving settlers remained customers. Gregor visited Severin's dome and spent an afternoon examining the construction and questioning Severin about materials, costs, and performance. He was particularly interested in the fuel savings, calculating the economic value of reduced wood consumption over a typical winter. His estimates suggested that a family using Severin's design could save $30 to $40 in wood hauling costs annually, a substantial sum for homesteaders operating on tight margins. More importantly, Gregor recognized that the technique addressed a fundamental problem across the entire prairie region. The lack of timber was not unique to this particular area. Homesteaders throughout Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas territories faced identical fuel scarcity, a building method that dramatically reduced heating requirements while using free materials would have value across thousands of square miles of grassland. Gregor asked permission to share what he had learned with settlers along his trading route. Severin agreed readily, even providing sketches and written notes that Gregor could show to others. He emphasized that the technique required patience and attention to detail, but no specialized skills or expensive materials. Anyone willing to invest time in proper construction could replicate the results. Gregor carried this information south and west over the following months, stopping at settlements and isolated homesteads to describe what he had seen. The response varied by location and audience. Some settlers dismissed the idea as impractical or too labor-intensive. Others expressed interest but doubted their ability to execute the design without direct guidance. A few took careful notes and asked detailed questions, clearly intending to attempt the construction. Gregor estimated that perhaps 1 in 10 homesteaders, he told, would actually try building a dung-packed dome, but across the population of struggling prairie settlers, that percentage represented significant numbers. By autumn 1869, reports began filtering back about structures built using variations of Severin's method in scattered locations across the territory. A Norwegian family near Yankton had built a rectangular version using the same wall composition but traditional corners instead of dome geometry. A German settlement west of the Missouri River had constructed a communal structure for winter gatherings, sized to accommodate 40 people with thermal mass walls 4 feet thick at the base. These adaptations demonstrated both the flexibility of the core principles and the way good ideas evolved as they spread. Severin heard about these variations through Gregor's trading network and found them fascinating. He had provided a template, but others were modifying it to suit their specific needs and cultural preferences. The technique was becoming less about copying his exact design and more about understanding thermal mass principles and applying them creatively. The spread of knowledge continued without Severin's direct involvement. He had shared what he knew freely with anyone who asked. Those people shared with others, and the information propagated through the scattered homesteading network. Severin Holmgren lived in his earthen dome for 14 years, from 1868 until 1882, when he sold his Dakota claim and moved to Minnesota to be near aging family members. During those years, his structure performed exactly as designed, requiring minimal maintenance and providing reliable warmth through 13 more prairie winters. The walls never cracked seriously enough to compromise thermal performance. The dome geometry remained stable despite seasonal freeze-thaw cycles. The building outlasted most timber cabins in the area. By the time Severin left Dakota, an estimated 60 to 70 structures using thermal mass wall construction existed across the territory. The exact number was impossible to determine because homesteaders built independently without central record-keeping, but travelers and traders reported seeing dung-packed domes and similar designs scattered throughout the grasslands. Some were faithful copies of Severin's original design. Others were creative variations that retained core principles while adapting form to different needs. The technique never became dominant. Most settlers still built conventional sod houses or timber cabins when wood was available. The labor intensity of proper thermal mass construction discouraged widespread adoption, and many homesteaders lacked the patience for methods that required months of careful work. But for those willing to invest the effort, the benefits were undeniable. Structures built using Severin's principles consistently outperformed conventional designs in fuel efficiency and winter comfort. The broader impact extended beyond individual buildings. Severin's success demonstrated that frontier innovation did not require formal education or expensive materials. A Swedish immigrant with basic carpentry skills and childhood memories of old building methods had solved a significant survival problem using resources others considered worthless. That example encouraged creative thinking about other frontier challenges, showing that conventional approaches were not the only options. Severin never profited from his innovation. He charged nothing for advice, shared his techniques freely, and took no credit when others built similar structures. His motivation had been personal survival, not financial gain or recognition. Having solved his own shelter problem, he was content to help others solve theirs. This generosity ensured wide dissemination of knowledge, but left him anonymous outside the immediate area where he had built. He died in Minnesota in 1891 at age 64, having lived a quiet life far removed from the prairie where he had built his impossible dwelling. His obituary made no mention of his construction innovations or the structures that still dotted Dakota grasslands using methods he had developed. To his Minnesota neighbors, he was simply a retired homesteader who had spent years out west before returning to family and familiarity. But in Dakota Territory, now divided into North and South Dakota states, his legacy persisted in physical form. Some of the thermal mass structures built in the 1870s and 80s remained occupied into the early 1900s, providing warmth to second and third generations of prairie families. The buildings themselves were testament to principles that transcended individual invention, proving that ancient knowledge, combined with careful observation, could solve modern problems in unexpected ways. Severin Holmgren had not discovered something new. He had remembered something old and applied it where it was needed most.